Asalaamu Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala khayr al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I would like to welcome everyone here that's been with us from the beginning in the fall semester lecture series. And we're continuing with the list of speakers that are honoring us with their presence and their really knowledge during this series. Today's lecture is a dear one to me because I worked with Dawood Yasin on his MA thesis, and I know that his lecture today is a reflection of the thesis that he submitted for his MA at Dartmouth. And this topic is a very important topic that often is overlooked. Muslims often speak about having halal, but not understanding the halal Tayyib relationship. And I think Dawood's work in his thesis, and I definitely will encourage him to continue to work on it to be published, because it will add to the literature on the concept of halal and Tayyib, and expanding our consciousness on what healthy living is all about. Especially as we are here in Berkeley, and the importance of both the center of the organic movement and center of environmental movement in general is in this neighborhood. Now, Dawood Yasin is the Director of Student Life and Experiential Learning at Zaytuna College. And for those who are students of ours and those who really tune to our website, there are a number of projects that Imam Dawood leads in the experiential learning, and literally it's actual learning, which is an extension of the classroom to the outside. In our Islamic tradition, we say al-ilm wal-amal, and Dawood Yasin combines al-ilm and al-amal both inside the institution in the classroom and outside. For those who went camping with him or have benefited from the classroom in the archery or went to the various trips across the US in Ferguson or in Utah and hopefully in other places as well, he adds considerably to the depth of the institutional capacity of Zaytuna College to actually provide a well-rounded education. I would not take more of your time, but it's really an honor and pleasure for me to introduce Dawood Yasin as he speaks about Tayyib, the foundation of ethical eating and conscientious consumption in relations to our understanding of food from an Islamic point of view. Would you please help me welcome Dawood Yasin to the microphone?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Asalaamu Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I thank all of you for coming out this evening and giving some of your time, which I know is precious to all of us, on a subject that is very dear to me, as Dr. Hatem said, and mashallah, I appreciate Dr. Hatem for being on my committee and encouraging me to continue to write about this subject. I think in no way is this any type of definitive work, but rather it is work that comes from opinions and thoughts and ideas that I have both through my study and through experience as well. And when I came to a point with my first reader was that this is really the beginning of the conversation. There's not a lot of people that are working on this. There's not a lot of material that's published on this. It's very sparse. You have to find it kind of in places that is not as evident, perhaps, as it will be. I really think a friend of mine who's at Harvard right now finishing up his PhD is writing on the similar subject as well, too, and it will really be kind of the depth of work that we haven't seen in it. But you know, I really think that I've come to see this work as a nexus of my studies, in that it brings together many things: spiritual discipline, ethics, and law. Right? And we all know that you are what you eat, and we know this. But do we act on it, affirming that we are actually mind, body, and soul? Right? Do we act on that idea that you are what you eat, affirming the fact that we are mind, body, and soul? So this subject, I think of it in a way that continues to whisper in my mind, nourish my body, and challenge the inclinations of my soul. However, for many Muslims I encounter, the inner realities associated with food and ethics and metaphysics remain an afterthought. So the first question that I'll share with you is how did I begin thinking about this? Well, it actually starts back in the front seat of a pickup truck in the early part of my Islam when I was working as a carpenter. And a friend of mine who I was working for at the time for his company, he just threw out this idea that he said, I don't eat industrial meat, industrial produced meat. So the first question was, well, what's industrial produced meat? Right? So that started, this conversation. And once I answered that question, I had to ask myself, well, where are the Muslims on this point? And I thought to myself, well, if he has this kind of problematic relationship with industrial produced meat, well, then he must not know what the Muslims are doing because, their ways of slaughter are absolutely incredible. Because what it did was it took me back to the spring of 1996 when I was in Cape Town, South Africa. That's actually where I converted to Islam. And I converted prior to the Eid, which is the Eid al-Adha, which is the Eid of the sacrifice at the Hajj. So I actually witnessed at the beginning of my Islam, which was an incredible spiritual, ritualistic slaughter that took place there, and it had a profound impact on how I understand my relationship to meat in the process of animal slaughter. Right, so I'm thankful that my first experience with ritual slaughter was conducted in a manner that upheld what I now understand to be the guiding foundational principles of ethical slaughter that bring together legal rulings and metaphysical realities. However, in thinking back to that, I thought to myself, well, it's actually, I was the one who didn't know anything. So as Muslims, the uncritical acceptance of the standards and practices of industrial meat production by many American Muslim communities have reached deplorable levels. The goal to produce more meat for consumption forces farmers to house animals in walled structures akin to factories where animals are grown for slaughter. And this is something that we know, obviously, this is a conversation that's been happening in Berkeley. I'm actually a Berkeley transplant. I've only been here for about 4.5 years, so if I'm telling you things that you already know and have known since the 60s and 70s, please forgive me. This idea of chickens crammed into these spaces, for example, that they're stepped on, kicked, fed to the point of obesity that prevents them from walking, their legs buckling under the weight of their unnatural bodies. Such actions stem from purely legal concern for slaughter that is divorced from the ethical or moral considerations. This is the point that I want to get to. Right? To change these detrimental practices and ulterior economic motives associated with animal husbandry and ritual animal slaughter, informed American Muslim voices must not remain marginalized. Rather, they should strive to return to Islamic morality and ethics regarding food consumption and reassert Islam's spiritual connection with the environment. In the examination of Muslim industrial meat production and ritual slaughter, we find that when morality and ethics are not considered, most Muslims only concern themselves with positive injunctions that regulate behavior. Most do not consider relevant or important negative injunctions, meaning things that are haram, that proscribe certain other behaviors. Right? Such a decision contradicts the universal concept of mercy. Okay? So now I'm thinking, well, why are Muslims in this state? Doesn't the Islamic tradition call us to uphold the highest legal and ethical standards with regard to our food? Doesn't the Islamic tradition clearly establish a relationship between food and whether or not our prayers, our supplications are answered? Didn't our Prophet ﷺ teach us that animal welfare is a fundamental principle in our tradition? So these are questions that have stuck with me for over 2 decades. I've come to realize that the answers are extremely complex and nuanced. The issues include the divorce of law from ethics, colonial subversion, global economics, and the clash of modernity and tradition. Given that this is the case, where does one even begin? It's a daunting task. Being at Zaytuna allows me to participate in sustained conversations such as this. Teasing apart all of these nuances is something that has only happened to me at this college. What I mean to say by that is that it does happen in other places, but the conversation on this subject is really just a passing point of interest. But here it is not just a conversation. Rather, we continue to make it a critical piece of experiential learning that takes theory off the shelves and puts it on the plate. Just yesterday I was speaking with a student He was in my office, and he shared something to me, which I think is a profound insight from his family law class, which I thought was really interesting, right? Where else are young Muslims studying primary texts in Arabic of family law and thinking of the implications of metaphysical realities of breast milk and food? He said, with this concept of a milk mother in the Islamic tradition, that legal status of lineage is established through nursing. And then the student then said and asked, so how important is it that the food that a person puts into their body, how important is the food that a person puts into their body when God determines that blood ties are a result of that food? I mean, that's profound. That's profound. That a legal status of lineage is established through that. So what is it then that we should be putting into our bodies? And that made me think, right after hearing that, I said, what are the metaphysical implications of swapping out that breast milk for Similac? Right? Does this act now establish lineage with myself and the Nestle Corporation? Right. You do know that corporations are humans, correct? So what do I mean by lineage being established through nursing? If someone who is not the biological mother, this is a little bit of, going back in a little bit of law, if someone who is not the biological mother of that child breastfeeds that child, the child's legal status, the lineage is established. The child who is being nursed by this woman is now essentially a sibling of her children and all the legal implications that follow that. Right? The closest understanding that I can share with you through my experience prior to my Islam is the relationship of a godparent. Right? But I find that modern, in our kind of, in the discourse that we're in right now, that many people will look at milk and just look at the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fat. Or a person only focusing on law will look at the legal status of the individual. However, both of these points must be given their due, and they are not mutually exclusive. But in addition to that, we must think about the metaphysical effects of our relationship with food. Combining the legal, the ethical, and the metaphysical realities of food is what I consider conscious consumption. Right? So I'll share some things here with regard to my thesis, and Dr. Hatem talked about that a little bit. What I wanted to write about in my thesis was this idea of Muslim industrial meat production and its challenge to the ethical practice of Islam. Its challenge to the ethical practice of Islam. If Muslims are engaged in industrial meat production and the way that it is happening right now, how do we ethically practice the religion of Islam? Right? So the moral and metaphysical purpose concerning Muslim discussions about animal slaughter is extremely important to the analysis of the American Muslim industrial meat production. Right? Regarding food consumption, the Quran states, وَكُلُوا مِمَّا رَزَقَكُمُ اللَّهُ حَلَالًا طَيِّبًا. So this is the point that I want to talk about. So eat of that which Allah has bestowed upon you of your food, lawful, halal, and tayyib, which is pure. Right? So these are the 2 points here, and that comes up 4 times in the Quran. This combination where halal and tayyib are 2 words that are placed right next to each other only appears 4 times in the Quran, and we'll talk about that as we get in a little bit further. Right? So does this suggest that the injunction against the consumption of certain types of meats only addresses the permissible command, the halal, and dismisses the pure, the tayyib aspects of the verse? If one dismisses these considerations of ethics, if one dismisses considerations of ethics and morality in the interpretation of this verse, the consumption of meat fails to reach a spiritual level. Over centuries, many factors have influenced a shift in the Muslim ethos concerning Islamic practice and norms, and Muslim industrial animal slaughter and animal husbandry in particular. One of the major factors in this shift was the impact of colonial influence on the Muslim scholarly class in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Muslim scholars once enjoyed political and financial autonomy, and thus they were free to make decisions without the influence of colonial needs and ambitions. For example, during the British occupation of Egypt, Al-Azhar represented the highest authority of orthodoxy from Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, from the Sunni tradition, and the head of the university maintained an extremely influential position because of this. Rulings issued from the scholars were considered authoritative throughout the Sunni realm. Conflicting legal rulings issued by scholars have confused some Muslims. At the center of this confusion is the question whether the act of animal slaughter is non-ritual or a ritual act, which is called ta'abbudi or adi. It turns out the answer differs depending on many factors. Some of these factors relate to the adherence of specific schools of jurisprudence, legal authority, and even cultural influence. For a clearer understanding of the answer, one needs to refer to the primary sources of law, namely the Quran and prophetic traditions, a hadith. Kevin Reinhart, a scholar of Islamic law at Dartmouth College, sorry about that, affirms at this point, I was just joking. I mean, I actually worked with him on my independent study, and he's a great scholar. So Kevin Reinhardt at Dartmouth College affirms at this point that he writes, there is no question and no discussion of whether the Quran is significant in itself. Therefore, the foundations of the entire system of fiqh thought is the Quran. Its significance is chiefly that the Quran is an unparalleled window into the moral universe. In matters where Islamic practice are not clearly defined, the Quran maintains the authoritative position in Islam, representing the primary source of legislation and establishing moral guidelines of human conduct and needs, such as ritual, animal sacrifice, and food consumption. Regarding food consumption, the Quran has injunctions that delineate general directives, the Sharia, used by Muslim jurists to determine speculative reasoning, which we call fiqh, and regarding the matters of permissible and unlawful food consumption. So there's a verse that really, I think is the verse that sets out this, it's in the 5th chapter of the Quran, it's the 3rd verse, where the prohibitions of what Muslims now can, in post-revelation, can consume. Hurimat Alaikum, it starts off, and then it gives these categories, right? Al-Mayta, carrion, so anything that's dead, would dumb. And this is a direct consuming of blood. A lot of times I found that Muslims believe that somehow you have to drain every amount of blood from an animal, but that's actually physically impossible. There's no way that that can happen. So if you consume an animal that does contain some blood still in it, it's absolutely permissible to eat. I was recently in Spain, and I was talking. We were talking about this exact point, and I was speaking with people who actually this is what they do with sheep. Actually, they were in the sheep, producing lambs for meat and others. And actually, it was interesting because they were engaged in perhaps getting a contract with Etihad to have some of their meat now being served on Etihad Airlines. So they were prepping for this, the level that they were working on, the numbers, the volume that they were working on. And I asked them, I said, do you hear this idea of Muslims saying we have to drain all of the blood from this? They said it's physically impossible. And I think what happens is it shows us the distance that we actually have from the process is really what it is, right? It's a great theory because we read here that it says dumb in the ayah, but that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a consumption of blood that used to be a practice in what we call jahiliyyah, so pre-revelation. And the verse goes on to talk about other categories. There's one category in particular that I want to talk about here, which is mawqudha, because it will come up later on, which is really, it's like a bludgeoning. So one of the things that now has been prohibited at the advent of Islam is that a bludgeoning of an animal is impermissible with other things. Okay, so the distinctions made between Sharia and fiqh is significant to industrial meat production because it informs matters that are both legalistic and moral. Muhammad Kamali writes in his book, Sharia thus comprises in its scope not only law, but also theology and moral teachings. Fiqh is thus positive law that does not include morality and dogma. That's how he separates that. Any attempt at de-ritualizing animal slaughter must contend with the legal Quranic classifications that as they stand. So Muslims should always strive to attain perfection, which is considered, it was called Ihsaan in our tradition, to uphold the moral and ethical spirit of Islam. This is affirmed in a prophetic tradition, which says, verily Allah has prescribed perfection in all things. Inna Allah kataba ihsan ala kulli shay. And if you slaughter, slaughter well. And let each one of you sharpen your blade, and let him spare suffering to the animal he slaughters. Now, one of the things I thought was really interesting about this is that of all of the things that the Prophet could have talked about, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him, why is it that this is the point that ihsan is being prescribed to, animal slaughter? I mean, that should give you some thought for a moment. I have my own ideas, which is that, the amount of meat that we would eat later on, which in itself is problematic. But in fact, the Hajj, the numbers that come in, right, to ensure, again, this animal welfare being at the highest standard of it is something that I thought was really interesting in that. Okay, so again, this hadith sheds light on the widespread animal abuse and suffering associated with Muslim acceptance of modern industrial meat production, right? It illuminates that one of the most fundamental contradictions in Islam today involves animal slaughter and its disconnection from Islamic morality and ethics. Indeed, this is the heart of all contradictions in Islam. So now I want to talk a little bit about just the metaphysics here. Islamic spirituality is not based solely on metaphysics and esoteric idealism, right? A lot of times we like to escape to that place. But it's also grounded in tangible practice. Without struggling against the aspect of our being which is blameworthy, we call that the lower self in our tradition, we risk being full of empty talk. Before all of the lofty spiritual aspirations is the simple yet profound advice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who advised one of his companions, who was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. So this companion comes to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and asks him that he supplicate, meaning the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, supplicate to God, asking God to accept Sa'd's supplications. Okay? Now look what the response of the Prophet ﷺ, he says to him. He responded to him, he tells him, Ya Sa'ad, he says, eat from that which is Tayyib, and your supplications will be accepted. And I thought this to be really interesting, because he didn't say eat from the halal. He told him, eat from the Tayyib, and your supplications will be accepted. So if we look at the two categories of halal then being kind of the positive law, right? And the standard that is set for the legal injunctions for this slaughter to be just able to be consumed by Muslims, they're like, okay, that's a standard and you're in the door. But if you really want to get some work done on yourself, then there's another category which is that we're going to look at, which is the ethics and the morality and the metaphysics behind this. So pertaining to spirituality, in the Islamic tradition, a Muslim should be concerned with what comes out of their mouth and what goes in. Because both actions have consequences. Being scrupulous in what we eat leads to a greater spiritual clarity and proximity to God. This is what we believe in our tradition. And the oft-mentioned hadith, the Prophet Muhammad, pertaining to this subject, we find the following. He says, "Inna Allah tayyib la yaqul illa tayyib." So this is really interesting. He said that he uses the word tayyib. He says that God is pure and only accepts which is pure. Right? And he has commanded the believers to do that which he has commanded the messengers. So now all of a sudden you have that the followers are given the same standard with regard to their food as prophets are, right? And he says that God has commanded the believers to do that which he has commanded the messengers, which is what? Ya ayyuha rasulu kulu min tayyibati wa'malu salihah. So this action here is that what he's saying is that all of my messengers, this is a verse of Quran, Ya rusulu kulu min tayyibat, eat from that which is tayyib, and then work righteous actions. So it's interesting, again, it didn't say eat from that which is halal. It is eat from which is tayyib, then work righteous actions. Just again, something for us to think about. And there's another verse as well. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kulu min tayyibati ma razaqnakum washkurullaha in kuntum iyyahu ta'budun. So again, you have this concept of the tayyib, O you who believe. Eat from the tayyib that we have sustained you with, and then give gratitude, be grateful to Allah. So this is the first half of how this hadith sets up. So now it's telling you, eat from the tayyib, but now what happens? What happens is now the companions, it says, ثُمَّ ذَكَرَ الرَّجُلُ. They say that the Prophet ﷺ, it says, ثُمَّ ذَكَرَ الرَّجُلُ يَطِيلُ الصَّفْرِ. That the Prophet ﷺ mentions a man who is on a long journey. Ash'atha aghbara. Ash'atha, yani his hair is disheveled. Aghbara, he's covered in dust. Now this is important because the fact that he's on a journey, through our tradition, we believe, Muslims are believers, that one who is traveling, that their prayer is really accepted by God. Okay? There's other times also, time when one's breaking the fast, at the time of rain, when one is in hardship. So there are many kind of conditions and also places as well too that we believe that. But it's interesting here because now he is in a category where his prayer should be readily accepted, right? يَمُدُّ يَدَيْهِ إِلَى السَّمَاءِ يَا رَبْ يَا رَبْ. And he extends his hands to the skies, crying out, my Lord, my Lord. مَطْعَمُهُ حَرَامٌ مَشْرَبُهُ حَرَامٌ مَلْبَسَهُ حَرَامٌ وَغُذِيَ بِالْحَرَامِ. But Allah responds, God responds by saying that his food is haram, his drink is haram, his clothing is haram, and he's nourished by the haram. How can I accept his prayer? So when we talk about the metaphysical relationship of our food, talking about it in terms of our supplications being accepted, talking about it in terms of proximity to God, this is where I'm thinking about in terms of the conversation. Is it as simple as just, yes, it's halal, and we don't ask any questions about a manner in which the animal was raised, the wealth in which it was purchased with, the conditions of the person who is, questions that, again, take us outside of the fact that, yes, it was an animal, its neck has been cut, and khalas, yes, it's good, let's put it inside of our bodies. So again, this takes us to this, right? Are questions related to ethical eating simply questions of positive law, right? Or do they relate to issues of moral virtue, ethics, and public interest? In other words, if a certain food is halal, does it necessarily mean that it upholds the highest ethical standards? It's a question that we have to ask ourselves. At a lecture once, I was at Yale, a Muslim scholar spoke here about food and as a Muslim spiritual foundation, and his words really resonated with me. This is someone who was coming from Yemen, because really what it did was it embodied Islam's perspective of the locavore movement. He said there was a time when, where I grew up, we knew the person who owned the land that the food was grown. We knew the person who put the seeds in the ground. We knew the well where the water came from to irrigate the seeds. We knew the hands that harvested the wheat. We knew the hands that milled the wheat. We knew the hands that kneaded the dough. We knew where the wood came from that lit the fire to bake the bread. We knew the hands that served the bread, and we could vouch for every person in that chain as a person of piety. So this is an idea or ideal, however we want to think of it. I think of it as an idea. I don't think of it as in some sort of lofty ideal that we can't achieve. And again, this idea, that's why, just community gardens and CSAs and, again, we're in Berkeley and again, all of this is happening. But I'm asking myself, when we look and kind of open up that conversation with inside of the Muslim community, people at times look at you like you have two heads. And hopefully that will begin to change, and the discourse will begin to change on that. So what I'd like to do right now is just speak read a little bit more from my thesis, which really understanding Tayyib, and this comes from a verse of Quran. Again, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ كُلُوا مِمَّا فِي الْأَرْضِ حَلَالًا طَيِّبًا وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. So this is the second chapter of the Quran, verse 168. O mankind, eat of that which is on the earth, halal and tayyib, so lawful and pure, and do not follow the footsteps of Satan, for he is an enemy avowed to you. When I started my research on the moral and ethical dimensions of Islamic animal slaughter as relates to halal and tayyib, I was under the impression that the Quran would clarify the meaning of tayyib in explicit terms. I convinced myself that it would only be a matter of time before I would find the meaning of tayyib as the often overlooked ethical aspect of animal husbandry and animal slaughter in Quranic exegesis, in tafsir. Without it, how might one know to avoid following the footsteps of Satan? After extensive research, I have not found a definitive explanation in any of the four most influential exegeses of the Quran that connect the word tayyib with ethical ritual animal slaughter. In the process of searching the Quran, I realized that I was projecting onto the text what I wanted to be true. It was difficult to admit that what I wanted the commentary to say just simply was not there. The research proved to be a great learning process. I learned that the Quran leaves many aspects of legal matters vague, and by doing so, it allows for multiple interpretations in other time periods and contexts. What was most evident in this process is that law is not static, but rather it is dynamic. When a person examines the breadth of Islamic law, what is quite apparent is that legal certainties are few. This is because Islamic legal scholars allow for the probability of multiple interpretations. The reason for this is rooted in the belief of the scholars that God alone possesses perfect knowledge. Any ruling, therefore, that is not confirmed by dalil qat'i, meaning a convincing proof, affirmed by primary sources, is therefore based on approximation and a preponderance of evidence, and remains debatable and open for interpretation. Many pre-modern scholars define tayyib as pure. and attribute the meaning to an individual's wealth, meaning wealth that is from a pure source as defined by Islamic law. Given the consistency of opinions conveyed on this subject, one can assume that the explanations were precisely what society required at that time. Because all of the mufassirs and those that were explaining hadith, they were all consistent in that point that Tayyib referred to a person's wealth. And as I said, this is what I feel was precisely what society required at that time. In our day and age, Tayyib may comprise, again, this is my thoughts here, Tayyib may comprise other ethical considerations that accompany ritual slaughter. The triliteral root of the word from Tayyib shares the meaning in good health. The implications meaning adds significantly to the pre-existing idea that emphasizes purity in wealth. Applying this meaning to the life of the animal drastically alters the state of animal husbandry and ritual slaughter. Do you see the point that I'm getting at here? That if we can move away from a kind of a narrow interpretation of it that is solely material, that we can then broaden it to include, as we said, not only the metaphysics as relates to us, but also to the natural world as well. The implication, as we said, applying this meaning to the life of the animal drastically alters the state of animal husbandry and ritual slaughter. Tayyib, with the meaning of in good health, remains true to the text while at the same time draws focus to the well-being of the animal. This rethinking and subsequent application is what I intended when I stated that Islamic law is dynamic and capable of addressing issues in both pre-modern and contemporary times. Our challenge in modern times is to broaden rather than to give in to the temptation of narrowing. Our challenge in modern times is to broaden rather than give in to the temptation of narrowing the ethical recommendations considered integral to animal husbandry and ritual slaughter that, when upheld, fulfill the spirit of the law. Most Muslims believe that abandoning the prophetic ethic in animal husbandry and animal slaughter is to follow one's own caprice. For most Muslims, the prophetic ethic represents discipline. Abandoning it represents deviance from prophetic guidance and is therefore capricious. Hatem Kamal writes in his book Sharia Law and Introduction, the Quran has warned people no less than 25 times of the evil consequences of indulgence and caprice, of hawa, and of the hold it can have on their hearts and minds. And he substantiates this with a verse in the Quran that who is more misguided, the one who follows his caprice, his hawa, and neglects the guidance of God. Many Muslims lack knowledge regarding the ethical practices of animal husbandry and animal slaughter in Islam. Encouraging the American Muslim community to uphold Islam's core ethical tenets might be interpreted as divorced from the religious foundation, because much discussion about the issue is primarily focused on the legal, technical aspects of animal slaughter. Doing so, however, will help the American Muslim community learn that many Americans involved in humane animal husbandry and animal slaughter are operating on a platform quite like the ethical considerations found in Islamic ritual slaughter. Bringing these two groups together can serve as a means for seemingly non-aligned groups to join ranks in sharing best practices that can continue to raise the standards of ethical animal husbandry and ritual animal slaughter. It will also serve to bring people of diverse backgrounds and religions together to work towards a common goal of decreasing tension and social polarization between Muslims and non-Muslims. It's important to look at the pre-modern exegesis of the Quran as they relate to the 4 verses that contain the command to eat food, combining the 2 words of halal and tayyib. How are we doing for time? Yeah? Just because there's another section I want to read. Is there? Yeah? As I said, it's important to look at the pre-modern exegesis of the Quran as they relate to the 4 verses that contain the command of halal and tayyib. Right? Central to the examination of primary sources regarding meat and slaughter is an understanding of the command in the Quran to eat foods that are halal and tayyib. Right? So that's the basis that we're starting from. By doing this, we establish through the Quran the mandate for Muslims to consume food that meets the obligations of being halal and tayyib. Right? That's obvious. Equally, as mentioned previously, it is hard to find a definitive meaning of the word tayyib when it is mentioned in conjunction with the word halal in the Quran. In texts other than the Quran, we find much written about halal, about fulfilling the technical aspects of animal slaughter. The reason why tayyib is often disregarded or overlooked is likely because the hyper-legal approach to the law blinds the Muslim community to the ethical standards found in ritual animal slaughter. The point of hyperlegal consideration is important to emphasize. The Quran itself does not give clear directions on how to complete the technical aspects of slaughter. Rather, details pertaining to the technical aspect of slaughter are principally found in the corpus of hadith. And there are really, three aspects of the slaughter that one must fulfill to complete a halal slaughter, which is really one is the method in which the animal is taken. The second is mentioning the name of God when slaughtering, and three, confirming the religious status of the slaughterer. Equal importance is given to all three requirements. What is not explicitly mentioned, however, is the concept of tayyib, and I asked it, why is this? And I argue that because over a millennium and a half ago, animals grazed and lived in ways that, like what is now defined as antibiotic-free, pasture-raised, and certified humane. Therefore, issues relating to tayyib as pertains to ethical treatment were not relevant as they now are in the modern mechanized society. Something that I found really interesting also in my research is there's a hukam, there's a ruling that talks about animals that eat impurities. So for example, chickens that will eat from cow patties, we'll call them, right? So cow, but they're actually eating, they're eating the protein, they're eating maggot, they're eating kind of bugs and other things that exist inside of them. So basically what they said there is that if an animal consumes meat to a point where the color, the smell, or the taste of the meat is changed by that, it is only what we call makruh tanzih. It is only something that is highly discouraged when eating it. It is not prohibited to eat that. But then I kind of shot back this question and thinking, if you've never, as a religious scholar of this time, if you've never performed a slaughter before, and I've met people who are imams, they've never performed a slaughter before. Right? How do you know what the standard is for the meat to change its taste, its color, or its smell? How do you know what the standard is? Right? If all you've ever been exposed to is industrial meat. And I can tell you there's a big difference. There's a big difference. And there's even a big difference, just places that I source my meat from, a farm in Vacaville or other places, it's hand slaughtered. The animals live outside. Compared to, I actually have been bow hunting for about 10 plus years. The meat that is pure, as in lives in the woods, its life is taken with an arrow, when this is complete, that meat in itself smells completely different of a sheep, for example, that I will get at a farm, just different standards. So again, this is something that I don't think can just happen in theory. And this is why, I think it's very important for us to begin to re-engage our tradition and not just kind of have a passive relationship with it, because it's too important. If we're talking about our supplications perhaps not being accepted or other things like this. So what I want to do here is really just the four verses that I talked about. It's Baqarah, it's 2:168. It's 5:88, it's 8:69, and it's 16:14, verse 114. Those are the four times in the Quran, as I said, where halal and tayyib come together. Basically, what I did was I took the what I feel are the four tafsirs, exegeses of the Quran, that would be most readily accepted or broadly accepted, which were Tabari, Razi, Zamakhshari, and Ibn Kathir. And what I did was I looked at each one of them, what they said about each one of those ayats. So I took these four exegeses of the Quran and looked at each one of them, what they had to say, and it was all pretty much the same. The tayyib aspect returned back to one's wealth. Return back to one's wealth. And again, it goes back kind of supporting my argument that I'm making by saying that that was for the time that they were in, and I'm not going to negate that isn't the case now, but I think in addition to it, we have to add, given the fact that how our food is treated, how our food reaches us now, up to this point, that we can begin to kind of rethink that by expanding the understanding of that with regard to tayyib. So here, what I want to do is I want to move to just giving you a little bit of the historical context and what I talked about when I talked about colonial subversion. This is something that really came out of a conversation, actually right in this room right here in Dr. Hatem's office, where he said, you know, you might want to look at this point and think about the relationship between Britain's occupation of Egypt and perhaps an impact that would have on this whole project. What I came up with, you know, what I found in terms of what I was reading was really interesting. Basically, Muhammad Abdu, Egyptian scholar, and I'll get into him a little bit here, but just basically he issues a fatwa, a non-binding legal ruling in 1903 that really changes the direction of this. So first of all, it's actually followed up by his student Rashid Ridha, who off of the work of Muhammad Abdu, basically Abdu says that, you know, chickens, it was in Transvaal, South Africa, 1903, he's asked the question, can we eat the meat of the Christians? Now, obviously that's clearly established inside of the Quran. No one's going to debate that. Yes, Muslims can eat meat from Christians and Jews, what are considered Ahl al-Kitab, okay? That's ma'ruf, it's something which is known. What happened in this fatwa was that the animals were actually being bludgeoned. And what he did was he took a ruling based off of an Andalusian scholar, Abu Bakr ibn Arabi, who was asked a series of questions again, and he was asked, you know, he was asked, would you eat the meat of Christians when killed in this way? And this goes down now to the issue that is inside of the Quran. There are two questions that he was asked. One is munkhaniq, which is strangulation. That's something that was inside of the verses that I talked to you about in the beginning, and he said absolutely not. And the second question he was asked was fatal. Now, fatal was very difficult to find. Yuftil means to actually twist something, but I looked in probably upwards to 50, 80 legal texts with an electronic search, looking for this word fatal coming up in relationship to food, and I couldn't find it. The only hadith that kept coming up over and over and over again was Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anhu, the second Khalifa, yuftil shawaribu, that he would twist his mustache. Was really the repeated hadith that I found over and over again. Now, the reason that I knew about fatal is because of actually hunting. And in the Levant, it's very much common practice for the Arabs that I had been in contact with, that when they're upland bird hunting and they would shoot dove or other small games, they would yuftil unuquhu, that they would take the thumb and twist and pull the head. And that was something that they said that they understood and was inherited. And now it's hard to determine exactly what it is. It was hard to find information on that. But basically what happens is that Abdu, he takes his ruling based off of the fact that there is a blanket statement made by Qadi Abu Bakr ibn Arabi that yes, we can eat their meat in any manner that they slaughter. So this is now where it opens this up, and then his student comes after him, Rashid Ridha, and says that actually slaughter is not even a ritual act, it's a non-ritual act. So why are we even having this conversation about it? Right? It's just like putting on your clothes, it's just like something else, you know, similar to that. So Mufti Taqi Uthman has a really interesting quote that I used here. He says, if slaughter was something unrestricted by ritual, meaning ta'abbudi laws, it would be permissible to eat an animal regardless of the religious affiliation of the one who slaughtered it. Right? So that right there shows you that it's connected to law. So therefore it's making it ta'abbudi and not adi. In the case of animal slaughter, therefore, the well-known fact that the slaughterer must be Muslim or Kitabi, meaning Ahlul Kitab from the Christians or Jews, is in itself proof that the food of an animal origin have a special place in Islamic law. So I took that, And here, again, I'll just give you a little bit of the context that we're talking about. The most significant shift in traditional Islamic law in the 20th century emanated from South Africa from the pen of the Egyptian Muslim cleric Muhammad Abdu, the highest-ranking Sunni jurist in the most influential Sunni institution in the world, Al-Azhar University. Abdu made a stark break with tradition when he ruled that it was permitted for Muslims to eat meat slaughtered by Christians not in accordance with Islamic law, a decision he issued in his Transvaal Fatwa in South Africa in 1903. What's really interesting is that there are actually 3 questions that were asked in the fatwa. The first one is, can Muslims wear the what would kind of the dust, what's that hat, like almost like a cowboy hat type of, what is it called, yeah, anyway, you know what I'm talking about, right? So the question was, can Muslims move away from like a large fedora, I guess that would be, right? Can Muslims wear this clothes? He said yes. The second question, the second question was the one about the meat that we asked about, can they eat the meat of the Christians? The third one was, can Hanafis pray behind Shafi'is because they say Ameen after the Fatiha? Now the interesting thing was, why is this question even being asked in Transvaal Fatwa? I'm sorry, in Transvaal, South Africa? Is because you had 2 groups from the British Empire that were being pulled into South Africa as colonial subjects. So then you had the Shafi'is that were coming, the Hanafis that were coming from the subcontinent, and then you had the Shafi'is that were coming from Malaysia. And the question was, can we pray behind them because they say Ameen after the Fatiha? And he said yes. He said yes to everything. So again, Abdu's ruling had a great impact throughout the Muslim world. It initiated a tectonic shift in the way Muslims experienced and understood the ritual and ethical nature of Islamic animal slaughter over the next century. While the amount of meat consumed by individual Muslims that slaughter their own animals is minuscule compared to the amount of meat the modern industrial halal meat production industry is able to produce, Muslims a century ago were profoundly more aware of the ethical practices indispensable to ritual slaughter than they are today. So I'm going to ask someone a question here. Has anyone come in contact, chickens or sheep or cow or something, with an animal that they actually eat? Has anyone, show that a raise of hands, come into contact with it, okay? Has anyone seen a ritual slaughter and partaken in some of the food that they, okay? And the last question, has anyone actually performed this act? Okay. So we see kind of the numbers, right, are going down as we ask that question. It's just, my point is that I feel that we're in a place now where we're comfortable outsourcing. We're outsourcing our children's education. We're comfortable outsourcing our own education in terms of our religious education. We're comfortable outsourcing kind of our nutrition. We're comfortable outsourcing all these aspects. And in here, this is something I feel, again, with our food. While the amount of meat, yes. So again, Muhammad Abdu's fatwa fulfilled the needs of the British occupiers, allowing British and local business interests to benefit from the new Egyptian industrial meat production industry. Given the context of the colonial aspirations of the British occupiers, it appeared that Abdu's radical ruling on ritual slaughter was influenced by British Empire's push for commercial gain, combined with scholars such as Abdu and his supporters from amongst the Muslim community's own desire to enact a reformist movement to revitalize what many Muslims believed to be a fossilized tradition after 400 years of Ottoman stagnation. Without Abdu's ruling, Muslims might be experiencing a completely different reality today with regard to ritual slaughter had Abdu attempted or been able to uphold instead of decoupling the Islamic ritual nature of animal slaughter and its ethical principles. I'm inclined to consider that Abdu's motives were profoundly influenced by the British government's dictates along with the inevitable realities of mass meat production. Muhammad Abdu was a late 19th century Egyptian scholar around 1849. Basically, he sent into exile. He's pulled out by the British, by Lord Cromer, and we'll talk about him a little bit because it's really interesting. In 1898, Azhar issues a fatwa doubling down on its position that it will not allow interest-bearing banks into Egypt. So all of this is happening, right? The Shehu in Sudan are falling to the British. So he's looking at kind of the Muslim world, the French occupation of North Africa. They're watching what's happening in Algeria. They're seeing what's happening in Morocco and these other places. So now he's looking at what's happening as well too. The banking system wants to come in. Now the interesting thing about Lord Cromer is that Lord Cromer is from the largest banking family in Europe, which precedes the Rothschilds. So it's not just kind of by chance that he's in there. This is an economic project. Because what had happened prior to this in Algeria was that 72, if I'm not correct, please forgive me, but it's something like that, 72% of the agricultural land in Algeria was under waqf. Okay, it was under waqf, meaning that it was controlled by the Sharia courts, and it was a means in which kept the scholars, as I talked about the autonomy for the scholars, it kept them funded. And it allowed their projects to run without influence. What happened was the French came in and said, actually, this idea of waqf is a bid'ah, an innovation that supersedes irth, inheritance laws, and wasiyah, meaning what is given over before one's death. And what they did was they began to bring scholars out of Algeria to France, educate them, and have them come back writing fatwas exactly stating that. So as this process begins to happen, more and more of the land begins to turn over to the point where all of that 72% of that arable land is now under French control. And they set up their agricultural business out of it. It's my thought that Cromer does the same thing. He pulls Abdu out of exile in 1899, 1 year after Azhar issues its fatwa on banking. What do you think happens in 1899? Abdu issues a fatwa saying that now Western banking system and usury, interest-bearing loans are now permissible. Next year, he does that. So that's why I'm thinking that this fatwa, again, there's a context that exists in this. It's not just out of the blue. This isn't just kind of happening. Because then 4 years later, he then issues the fatwa for the Transvaal fatwa, right? So here, again, you know, the Islamic traditions Abdu represented were considered an impediment to the process of scientific advancement and modernization. But as an Islamic scholar who could serve as an important function for the British colonial power, Abdu would play a vital role as he was appointed as the head of Azhar. So he's brought in, he's put as the head of Azhar, and then he's also put in after that as the head, as the mufti of Egypt. Again, his appointment as a colonial mufti paved the way for British colonial structure to convince its Muslim subjects that the Islamic tradition of ritual slaughter was nothing more than an antiquated practice. There were many factors that contributed to the tectonic shift in paradigm. The emergence of the nation state called for a post-religious existence regarding affairs of the state, domestic and foreign policy and commerce. The transition placed power in the hands of the corporate state that became responsible for food production, banks, and other bureaucratic aspects of the state. The local population easily accepted this shift because the modernization and corporatization of Egypt's food production was presented as Egypt's solution to mass food production. This first step in realizing the tectonic shift was the appointment of the colonial mufti, who would be a traditional voice doing the bidding of British and colonial business interests that were providers of these services. This is the value Muhammad Abdu offered in the British occupation and the English Council General of Egypt. Okay, so that's you know, where we're at in this place. Again, Cromer's connected to the banking system. His family is one of the largest banking families in there. You begin to see the nefarious actions that are taking place. And then we're just here saying, hey, you know what? Halal, not halal. Azhar says it's okay, right? Didn't you see that fatwa, brother? Right, I hear this all of the time. My question is, have you seen the fatwa, brother? Right, that's the question that I ask, right? So that's really at the essence of it. And then again, whether it's Azhar's fatwa, you have to be careful with that as well too. Because is it? There were many voices that were in opposition to his fatwa. There were many voices that were in opposition to his banking fatwa. There were many voices that were in opposition to his fatwa with regard to meat here, which opened up that door when he was a grand mufti. So again, just saying here, the French were able to remove the grip of Islamic law placed on the lands of Algeria by co-opting the ruling class. They did this by bringing the Algerian scholars to France and educating them at the Sorbonne and other institutions. This indoctrination allowed the French state to meet their needs in the Muslim colonialists, with Muslim colonial scholars, who in turn wrote the fatwas needed to carry out the French ambitions. So again, I feel that this is similarly just taking right from the playbook that was happening in there, right? And that's why Al-Halaq, who is at Columbia University. He's the one that I'm citing for his work on Algeria with regard to this. And he talks about that by saying that by 1871, the Algerian legal class was in disarray, meaning the Muslim scholarly class, in part because certain of the numbers lost moral authority by cooperating with the French. By the time of Algerian independence in 1962, the Sharia was reduced to nothing more than family law. Maybe they could come and study that. So, in closing, I just want to say that during my research for this thesis, I've come in contact with many religious and non-religious organizations that are working to restore the ethical aspects of animal slaughter to its rightful place. Muslims concerned with upholding Quranic injunctions regarding halal meat must move beyond the legal rulings of lawful or unlawful and inquire about how an animal is raised, what it is fed, and how it is prepared for market. These questions are associated with the philosophical meanings of Sharia. Such questions address issues of moral virtue and public interest and are important as the legal injunctions associated with them. This is because by doing so, Muslims remain committed to both the aims and the purpose, the maqasid of the law, as defined within the legal system. Islam, along with other major world religions, has always taught compassion and humane treatment of animals. In Islam, compassion and humane treatment are specifically prescribed and emphasized during the ritual slaughter. This is the same hadith that I mentioned about sharpening your animal. So again, given the practices that accompany industrial meat production, Muslims cannot, in good consciousness, accept these acts as a standard consistent with the meaning of halal and tayyib. While every person requires food to sustain his or her life, Muslims are required to follow specific injunctions that require them to eat food that is both lawful, halal, and pure tayyib. However, if Muslims remain focused on the technical aspects of animal slaughter alone, they will continue to reject the Islamic ethical teachings. At the same time, they will unsuspectingly propagate the heart of all contradictions, missing those opportunities capable of generating a robust Muslim environmental consciousness. I thank you for your time.
If there are any questions, you can step to the microphone on the left. Please line up on the left-hand side of the room.
I'll give him a second, yeah.
What did we learn in Standing Rock? That water is life, so I just want to get some life in me. Alaikum salam.
So, I mean, I'm sold on what you're talking about. I guess what I'm interested in, to just jump into the practical kind of recommendations, right, is I guess maybe two parts. What can we do to sort of propagate this consciousness? And then two, practically, what are some places that you maybe recommend for us to source our meat from within the Muslim community living here?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So, mashallah, thank you for that question. You know, this is not just theory. This is something that really was kind of, again, taking it back to that question that when I was in the truck, I don't eat industrial produced meat. I was like, wow, what is it? And that really got me, inspired enough to actually seek out. And like I said, there are local farms here. There are individuals that have farms. I think one of the most beautiful things that I saw was a documentary. There was a documentary put together by an interfaith group, and it was called Renewal. And basically, it was the part that I want to talk about was in Illinois, Muslims that were working with farms in rural, outside of Chicago and in other major cities, were connecting with these farmers. And it was absolutely amazing. I mean, sitting down, breaking bread with them, talking about each other's traditions and practices, and getting to know one another. So I think that's something that's really interesting, is even for us, I really think that you will be a pioneer in this. Anyone that kind of embarks on this right now, I mean, it's picking up some steam, but I still think that we're at a place where, can you have it delivered to my house, or where is it local where I can go get it, or that's kind of far, you're asking me to drive 45 minutes. I think that we really have to, like, if it's that meaningful to us, then we really have to put the groundwork in to be able to do that. So, for example, Nature's Bounty is a farmer that's in Vacaville. Ahmed is a great brother. Alhamdulillah, I was introduced to him by Najib, who works here when we first arrived here. And what happens is that, like a small community begins to form. I remember having an Excel sheet with 20 names on it, 15 chickens for Ahmed and 4 for Aisha and 1 for Dr. Hatem and other, so we were kind of going out and kind of providing the service for people as that was happening, and really I just think it's something again that kind of closes that door. So I think there are other races right here on San Pablo. I think it's just called like the Halal meat shop. I think that's what I just kind of know. But it's right next to Indus. Indus as well too is another place. I haven't been to Indus, not because I just haven't put the time in to know, but I know the brothers that are at the Halal store. I've talked to them. The farm where they get their animals are sourced from. And in each kind of, it begins, once you kind of enter into that group, things start coming to you. Hey, there's a new space opening up over here, I'll get an email. Or, there's another shop that's opening up over here, or someone's trying to put together this effort. And then you'll also find, that these things will begin to just kind of open up to you organically, right? And do that. I think the other thing also is beginning to learn the process yourself. I think about that in terms of just where do I want to put my time in, right? This is something that's really important to me, and just to be able to have that skill, if we're ever in a situation that I needed to feed myself in that capacity, at least something that I feel comfortable and am able to do. So it's kind of in something that's, kind of where that is. Alhamdulillah.
If there are any other questions, please go forward to the mic on the left.
So I'm thinking about the intersection between climate change, and I don't know if you get to touch on that at all. It's a huge thing, but it kind of came to me when you're talking about how we need to focus on the metaphysical aspects as opposed to just the technical aspects, because that's something that I'm very interested in. So that's going to be something that I'm definitely going to take into my work. I'm guessing that you've probably thought quite a bit about it, because they are connected. So just anything you have on that.
In terms of meat production and the impact on climate change?
In general, it being a thing that Muslims have to kind of, like you said, lay the groundwork for as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, it's something, obviously that we can't escape. I remember watching An Inconvenient Truth and now thinking that we're actually living the things that he's talking about these superstorms and, excessive rain, excessive drought, excessive heat, excessive cold. Like, these are realities I feel that we're actually experiencing right now. When he put out the first one, I want to say it wasn't Newt Gingrich, it was Al Gore. Sorry, thank you. Sorry about that. Newt didn't put that out. So yeah, I think one of the things that I found is that it's all through our tradition. So we're not kind of like the Yahya come latelys, you know what I mean, that are just kind of coming up to this conversation. When you look at the foundational aspects of the text, it's all right there. I mean, how are you understanding, you know, وَالسَّمَاعِ الْبُرُوجِ, the stars and the skies and the oceans and the rivers and all of these things, and how are they impacted with regard to climate change, and how are we understanding them through these things? You know, one of the things that I thought was just really profound was, you know, that you know, again, from a metaphysical level, just thinking about this was two things, kind of convincing Muslims on this idea, right? Well, one of the things that I said was that, you know, you actually already believe that there's a relationship between your worship, the earth, and your afterlife. Because one of the things that we do after we perform our obligatory prayer is we get up and we pray a supererogatory prayer. But we're advised to move and pray it in a different place. And the idea is that the earth will bear witness for you, so therefore be abundant in the places on the earth in which you pray. So therefore, you're already confirming it. The fact that you got up and moved over and prayed 2 rak'ats means you believe there's a connection between your ibadah, the earth, and your akhirah. So therefore, if you are just not concerned with recycling, or you're not concerned with composting, or you're not concerned with these types of things, how can you do it now for your prayer, but not for, you know, these items that are extremely detrimental? I mean, there's a Harvard Journal review I was reading of the aspect. And that's the interesting thing also about kind of the impact. You know, who's impacted? It's normally poor brown people. That's normally people that live next to waste facilities. So it's their water that's impacted. It's their air quality that's impacted, right? Not ours. We get to live out, in other places and not really be impacted by that. So again, we can't, on one side, social justice, rah, 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 social justice, rah, 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 and then leave this aspect, which is really impacting the same people that we're calling out for social justice for. Right? We have to wake up to these blatant hypocrisies. I'm sorry. We have to wake up to these blatant hypocrisies. So we have to think about it kind of in that way. And I don't want to be kind of the wet blanket on people, but the stakes are high, and we can be a part of this. As I said. Again, when I read from the prophetic biography and I read, these things, it's just amazing. And one of the things I think about as well, too, is just engaging our children in this and telling our children about these stories and telling our children about the meanings and the importance of these things so they see it through that lens, right? We don't take them to an eco-justice rally and that's kind of what they do and then we're there on that. No, this is something that we do as well, too, and we're joining in with this, right? That's something that I think of as well, but... yeah, so some thoughts I have on that.
Asalaamu Alaikum. Could you comment on, could you maybe say a few words about like mindful eating? In the sense that, oftentimes we're eating and we're sometimes just watching something and we're not focusing on the bite. Is there any, I'm not sure if there's any kind of Islamic connection to that. And yeah, just if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think is interesting, Neil Postman said what the television did was it took us from circular dinners to linear dinners, right? So now we're sitting in front of the television in a line and we're not talking to each other because we're all facing the television. So I thought that was really profound. I think mindfulness is not just like, what we're eating, when we're eating. I think for me, some of the things that we do is backing it up even to the preparation, right? So if we have these ideas of perhaps reading Quran on vessels of water, which is a prophetic practice, do the same thing when cutting vegetables, right? Something that going around and it brings the family together. In that capacity. So I think what that does then is it, one, we believe in this idea of barakah and blessings and adding blessings to our food, if you will. But I think in terms of mindfulness, this idea of eating while engaged in other things is, I don't think that it allows us to really think about that food, right? Especially if you're eating meat. You think about this, it's like something gave up its life. If you want to get into the whole argument of sentient beings, non-sentient beings, of plants and animals and things like that, it's a whole other discussion. But the idea that that we want to be present because of the blessings that are in this thing. One of the things that I really found amazing is Ramadan, right? So we should actually be eating less, which would probably create less waste, but we end up ordering like 2 dumpsters for the masjid in Ramadan, right? Because the waste increases. How? I don't know. Maybe it's the blessing of the month. I don't know, something like that. But my idea is, when I look at things like getting a plate of food, for example, talk about being present, right? Get a serving of food that you can eat. Better to go back to the place serving yourself 5 times rather than 1 time and throwing away food. Because how is it that you will sit there and say, Alhamdulillah alladhi at'amana wa saqana wa ja'alna min al-muslimin, and throw that blessing into the garbage? I mean, it's something that we really have to think about. If we believe that every morsel of food is a blessing from God, and then we'll get up and rally about the underprivileged and under-resourced and those that don't have access to it, and yet we're doing something such as that. We really have to ask ourselves that question. And I think because I don't think that you can just make that leap, that you can then all of a sudden get to that spot and be like, oh, I'm mindful, this strawberry really smells good, really tastes good. I'm really thinking about where it's from right now, because there's other aspects that have to happen first for that to become a reality in your life. So that's just something that I think about.
Sorry.
Can I take this? Do you mind? So the question is, does Tayyib have to do with just meat? Absolutely not. What about doubtful ingredients? Absolutely. Or things like red wine vinegar. How do we stop ourselves from going overboard? Thank you. So again, there's red wine vinegar, that's a whole another discussion about alcohol and does it burn off in the process, and at the molecular level, when it's, there's a whole discussion, a legal discussion on that I'm not going to get into right now. But in terms of doubtful matters, I really think that this is something the Prophet said, inna halalan tayyib, inna halalan bayyin, wa inna haraman bayyin, wa baynahuma umurun mujtabihat, la ya'lamu kathiran min an-nas. That the halal is clear and the haram is clear. And between them are affairs that are ambiguous. And he says that man waqa'a fi shubuhat, and the one who kind of constantly walks that line on ambiguous affairs, they're going to fall into a matter of the haram. He says, he gives the example of a shepherd who grazes their flock, right, on the sanctuary, on the prohibited area of the king. One day, one of those sheep's going to walk into that area. So that's how I kind of look at these ideas of doubtful matters in food. We have to, and this is a part of a juhud, right? We talk about this idea of a struggle. Right? Yeah, I really love that cake, but there's monodiglycerides in there that I don't know are from a pig source or they are from a plant-based source. So therefore, da'a ma yuribuka illa ma yuribuka. Another hadith, leave that which doesn't make you doubt. Leave that which makes you doubt for that which doesn't make you doubt. And khalas, right? And for me, what I find is that this principle that as you give something up for the sake of God, God will replace it with something that is better for you, right? And that's really something that we have to have trust in and have faith in, right? It's like, all of a sudden your daughter becomes, or your child becomes this great, baker. You used to love sweets, and now you've given it up because there's all of these things that are inside of it, and you're like, well, this is delicious, right? I thought that, these things weren't supposed to taste that good or something like that, because only Little Debbie's has that market cornered, or, whatever it is, Nestle or, the chocolate chip company has these things cornered. No, they're the thing. And so again, just this idea, think about it, that the act of eating this thing could actually prevent your supplications from being, that's what's at stake. That's what's at stake. We wouldn't do anything that would jeopardize our bank accounts. Like if you did this, it would wipe out your bank account and bring it to zero. You'd be like, whoa, I'm going to stay away from that thing. This is something now that, again, that could be a means in which our supplication is not accepted. Right? So again, just at least working to close that door. Now, yeah, it's a daunting task, but again, better to be in the game and struggling and trying, because that's where, God's blessings are. than to give up and have te'as and have, despair. I just can't do it. No, don't allow that to happen. We can do it, right? We can do it. So anyway, that's what I would say here. Absolutely. It doesn't apply just to meat, not at all. And in terms of doubtful ingredients, better to leave them for that which doesn't make you doubt. Mm-hmm. Alaikum salam.
So I think practical steps that you can advise on us to kind of lessen our intake of, meat as well. I think that's also,
get involved in the process, man.
Right. So I mean, I think like honoring the process and honoring the fact that you want to connect yourself to the meat as much as possible and try to slaughter it. Yeah. But also, inculcating the idea that, hey, maybe we have meat once a week, or we have, seafood once a week, and the rest is more of a vegetable diet. How do you disseminate that in a thoughtful manner to, like, from what I understand, the Muslim community be just heavy meat eaters, right? And I don't know where that came from either. Maybe it's just like natural, from the macroeconomic phenomenon of industrialization. We're just all, the meat is so cheap that we just have it, right? But how do we go about and take real steps forward to our households, besides getting the source of meat, but also saying, okay, if we're going to support these people that have cottage industries right now, they're probably not going to be able to supply us with meat 3 times a week. So how do we lessen the intake ourselves and kind of dissuade ourselves from that demand of so much meat? How do we take those steps forward, in our households?
Yeah, it's a great question. But one is, I don't think that there's just a single answer to it, and everyone has to, plus the other thing is, I feel like it depends on what a person is doing. I feel that people that have a sedentary lifestyle, that their meat intake is going to be different than someone who needs that protein to if their work is they have physical activities in their work. So we have to gauge kind of all of those things. I was asked to come to a high school in Ohio and talk about Hajj. And talk about the sacrifice of Abraham. And I said, okay, great, I'm interested, and I'll come out and I'll do it. It was grades 9 through 12, and I said, but I actually want to perform a slaughter with the students. And the reason why I said that is because I wanted to get them involved in the process to see that an animal is actually giving up its life for you to be able to eat meat. So I think one of the things of slowing down that process is that you actually experience it, right? So now you think about how much meat I eat, how much meat I'm going through, how many animals does that relate to, right? So there's, I mean, I just think you just, I don't know how, it seems like to me, and I don't mean this in the way, but just all my friends that are Bengalis, they kind of take the pride in eating fish, but I don't see other Muslims like eating fish, Like and I grew up on an island, so I grew up on fish, and I lived there for time as a Muslim. You couldn't slaughter on the island by law, so we didn't have any halal meat. So it was pasta at that time. It was a lot of pasta and a lot of fish. But again, I don't see that. But again, now we're into the whole like mercury, and so it's it has to be farm raised to avoid the mercury and other things such as that. So, I mean, we're in a real funk right now. But one of the things that I think about is again is getting involved in the process to see like how much meat actually comes from this animal. You know what I mean? And how much do we eat? And really looking at it, like how much do we eat? Like how long does this lamb last? We have a lamb in our freezer right now that I slaughtered, weeks, some time ago. Or a deer that I've shot a deer in November. We've had meat from that into July, right? So if you shoot 2 deer, for example, a bow, and slaughter a lamb and get your chickens from there, like that's your footprint right there. Obviously there's travel and other things that are involved in it, but it begins to look a little different. And I think again you begin to preach, because like once it's gone, it's gone. Kind of ringing up on that. But again, I think, as I would just say, I really have found. Oh, that's what I said. So with the students, was really them understanding like what goes into their meat consumption, right? Like what actually has to happen for me to eat meat. It's not just going down the aisle and throwing it in the shopping cart. And so to spark that, to spark, and again, just kind of asking oneself, what is it? How much a chicken is being consumed, or how much red meat is being consumed, and really just asking yourselves that question: how much do I need? How much, like really asking yourself, like how much do I need to be able to fulfill, tasks and jobs, and really getting to that point of eating to live rather than living to eat. I mean, I know it sounds clichéic, but I actually find it to kind of work when you put these principles out in front of you. Salam, would you mind tying the importance of Eid al-Adha sacrifice and sort of impose religious connection to experiencing, understanding, and knowing the spiritual and practical act of eating meat? Tying in the importance of Eid. Yeah, I think this question is the question was about tying in the importance of the Eid, the sacrifice for the Eid, as sort of imposed religious connection to experiencing and understanding and knowing the spiritual and the practical act of eating meat. I think there are a few things. One is to really understand what it would mean in that act to be committed to sacrificing one's child. Right? I mean, it's unfathomable. It's really unfathomable, right? And that's one thing that I think that you really begin to understand of what Abraham's alayhi salam willingness to follow God's orders, right? That he was willing to sacrifice his son. Once you've engaged in that, so one, I think it's actually to understand the reality of that sacrifice. Two is the reality of the Eid also is actually for the poor to be able to eat meat, perhaps once in a year when they don't have the ability to pay for it at other times because the charity that comes with the meat, right? Normally they say 1/3 for one-third for self, 1/3 for family, and 1/3 for the poor. And that's just a recommended. You could give all of it. You could give 2/3 of it or half of it or whatever. But really another idea is that you're actually supplying meat to people that don't get to eat meat except for around the Eid. Is something else. I don't understand the last part of the question, so please forgive me.
Asalaamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I just want to mention I have not eaten meat for probably over 30 years. I just want to make a point that to me, myself, it feels good to me to move like that, and I never feel like I need to eat meat. And, people have a right to do what they want to do, but I'm very thankful that I don't eat meat, and I never feel a need to eat meat. So I just want to put that out there.
MashaAllah. Thank you for putting that out there. Alhamdulillah, I appreciate that, Fenton, MashaAllah.
Alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Could you repeat the 4 ayats, please?
Yeah, it's 2:168, 5:88, and 6:114. It was the fourth one, and the third one.
869.
I'm sorry.
869.
16:114.
Okay.
That was the fourth one. And I think the last one is 23:51. No, I'm sorry, it's not 23:51. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay.
It's right here. I forgot the third one. What's that third one? 688:69. Anfal.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the correct response to people that will purchase non-zhabihah meat if it's organic because of the practices that some halal meat companies are engaging in, like giving the animals food that's making more estrogen, giving them hormones? Like what's the correct response?
Well, one is, I would say, are all Muslims doing? Is all Muslim meat? Is that the reality of all meat that Muslims can eat? But in terms of that, again, you have this issue of the amr to halal and tayyib. I guess for me, the question is, what is the logic that is being used when, when we're determining that just some grass-fed Angus, commercial meat or artesian meat, we'll even say, it's $27.95 a pound. I don't know that the law, Shari'i law, that allows for that. Okay. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the logic that I've heard is that, well, America is a Christian country, so therefore the people that are slaughtering are Christian, so therefore we can eat the meat, it's the meat of Ahlul Kitab. If you haven't determined that individual that is slaughtering your meat is Ahlul Kitab, you're stuck now. And then the premise that America, perhaps based on Judeo-Christian foundation at a time, but I think if we said right now that khalas, America is a Christian country, therefore to go down and eat, Safeway meat, because of that logic, I don't know that personally. I don't follow that, and I don't see that. But for me, I think the injunctions are too clear for me in terms of kulu, the eat, halal, tayyib, and I don't see where that is when it is not slaughtered in a manner that is aligned with the conditions that we talked about that are found within inside of Islamic law. So obviously, if they're from Ahlul Kitab or something like this, then yeah, absolutely, the people can partake in that, partake in that consumption. What I'm talking about is if we can't confirm that and don't know that, again, now you've opened yourself up to doubtful matters. And for me, just trying to avoid doubtful matters of the ones that I don't know about are hard enough, or the ones that I do know about are challenging enough. So each time I can put my finger on one of those, I want to eliminate that in terms of my going forward. So it's a bigger discussion. It's actually something that I really want to work on moving forward. There's an entire commentary or tafsir, that full section that deals with this relationship of the meat of Ahlul Kitab and the status of Muslim. And the spectrum is very, very broad. I think it's something that needs some work to be done. If there are other people that are interested in that, senior thesis, hint, hint. Just kind of doing some research and beginning to unpack that. I don't think we've really addressed that as a community. We've either just been like, no, we can't absolutely categorically, or khalas, everyone's Christian because we're in a Christian country and we could eat the meat. And it seems like kind of we fall into these two camps. And
It's probably time that we start eating more lentils and beans.
So you'll start eating more lentils?
Yeah, more lentils and beans.
MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you. Make sure to check our next lecture next Wednesday. So hopefully we'll see those of you that sign up. We'll send you on our email and look forward to having you back at Zaytuna College. Asalaamu Alaikum and good night.